Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Please continue to get the food and the breakfast that you need over here. We're delighted to have you with us this morning. My name is Stan Swim. I'm the Chief Program Officer for the Bill of Rights Institute, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome each of you to this morning's event. We recognize that we have some distinguished speakers who will be participating as part of today's program, and we'll introduce them individually as the program unfolds. At the outset, we acknowledge the generosity of Dick and Ethy Hayworth, whose sponsorship has made today's event possible. I also want to thank Kevin Hart, BRI's Director of Communications here in the back, who has planned this event and done so much to make everything come together so well. We know there's a little something going on out in the world and that you all probably have lots of things to do today, so we're very grateful and honored that you would choose to spend the beginning of your election day here with us. We thank our speakers who have taken time to prepare for the conversation today. As always at these things, we do have a couple of housekeeping items. First, our program will continue through breakfast. We invite you to get up and refresh a drink or get seconds if you want. Feel free to do that at any point during the program. You don't need to stay seated. Restrooms are located behind you with the men on this side and the women on this side. If you parked in the Weston Commerce ramp, we have validations for you at the registration table, so please remember to pick those up before you leave. Today's program is off the record. We want speakers and you as guests to be able to speak and interact freely. And we will be using a tool called Slido to invite your questions and bring them to our speakers. So you have instructions for that on your program. There's a little QR code and you can use your mobile phone to submit questions that will then be posed to the speakers. At the Bill of Rights Institute, we teach civics. We prepare and equip students and teachers to live the ideals of a free and just society. We provide materials and training to teachers in every state in America, including more than 1,300 teachers here in the state of Michigan who actively use our materials on a regular basis. That's about 1 in 4 of all high school and middle school history and civics teachers here in your state. American civics needs to be citizen-centered, not government-centered. And that isn't a minor point, it's fundamental. What do we mean when we use the word citizen? To give you an example of the difference from another setting, in the German language, the word for citizen is Mitbürger, which means literally with the castle, as in that's where someone looks for their rights, and it's because I'm with the castle. Instead of with the castle, we, the people, united to create a government not to provide our rights, but to protect them as our delegates, as our representatives. And of course, today is an election day, so government is very much on our mind. But today is only one decision that will shape what we do tomorrow. And what tomorrow becomes is dependent on us more than we realize. So our civics is first about who we are, and second about the systems and institutions we use to govern ourselves. It's why at the Bill of Rights Institute, we begin civic education with basic virtues, individual rights and responsibilities, and we've provided at your tables a two-sided handout that shows you the framework that we use to teach students basic civic virtues and the principle structure that underlies our nation's remarkable experiment in democracy. We work from there toward things like the branches in government, sort of the standard test and trivia questions that everybody's familiar with. But that isn't where we start, and that's by design. We as citizens really are the ones who are in charge. And we often don't feel united. We argue a lot. We always have as a nation. But from the outset, our nation has depended on conversation to raise ideas, to articulate principles, to reach agreements, and especially to work through our disagreements. It means that we should always be engaged in listening, learning, and persuasion. And today, we want to explore how we can do that together and do it better. We can build a more perfect union with each other as neighbors and fellow citizens. It's fitting that we meet here in what now is called the Lit, but has been the Ladies' Literary Club, something that began as a history class and evolved into a hub of learning and association throughout the last century. We're joined by an outstanding group of speakers. Our first certainly needs no introduction here, but his work deserves it. He's one of America's most influential business leaders and philanthropists, currently serves as the co-chair of the board of directors for Amway, the world's largest direct selling company, a company that helped many Americans learn how to seize their own opportunities, including my parents, as it turns out. He is the co-founder of the Doug and Maria Devos Foundation, which is committed to helping youth, families, and the community in Greater Grand Rapids obtain the resources and tools to achieve their full potential. The foundation has helped advance critical work promoting education, homeownership for lower-income families, and support for victims of domestic abuse. Our first speaker is also passionate about civics education and civic engagement. Through his Believe podcast, he brings together thought leaders for engaging discussions on some of the most challenging issues facing America today. Please join me in welcoming to the podium a businessman, a philanthropist, and an exemplary leader, Mr. Doug Devos.
Very kind. Well, thanks everybody. Good morning. It's an honor to have you here, and it's a thrill to be able to spend some time together talking about these issues that are so important, especially when it's election day. And I'm going to guess that in this room, we probably have a variety of different ideas about the election, or different expectations or hopes for the outcomes, but yet we're all here. We all came together in a place where we can gather and talk and learn together, meet new people, refresh relationships with older friends, and just be neighbors. And that's what our country is all about. And in many times, as we ask the question, are we too divided to come together? I'd say we can always come together. We should always be finding ways of coming together. And we need to talk about it more often than the people who want to try to take us apart. There's a big rift generationally about how people feel about our country, where older generations tend to feel more positive about our country, younger generations tend to feel more skeptical about our country. We may take that as a slice today. I'm guessing that was probably somewhat similar in polls that were taken in years past, and that's okay. To me, that shows a demonstration of a curiosity, of a desire to understand why I want to be an American, why this country is special or different or unique. Help them understand, help all of us understand at every age. What are the principles, what are the ideas that make America different? And why does that matter to all of us? And that's what we're going to have a chance today to do. And we talk about free speech. We talk about civil discourse. We talk about it in a way to talk with one another, to reason together, to overcome differences and gain understanding, maybe not to talk you into a different position, but at least you'll have a different understanding. A few years ago, we had an event in Grand Rapids. Jeffrey Rosen moderated a panel. We were talking about voting. We were talking about the Electoral College versus a nationwide vote. And we had experts up there. And Jeff, as he normally does, and I'm sure he'll talk about as well in his presentation, he said, okay, how many people believe one way? And some hands went up. How many people believe the other way? Some hands went up. So, okay, let's have the discussion. They had the discussion. At the end, he says, okay, how many people have changed their mind? Very few hands went up. Not many people changed their mind. He said, how many people have a better understanding of the other position? Everyone's hand went up. Everyone had a better understanding. No fights broke out. Everybody left probably a little more curious about the other side, maybe curious about what they believed in the first place. because they had learned something different. They had put it into context in a new way. And that's what we're going to try to hope to do today. And we're going to talk about the principles that bring our country together, founding principles that have stood the test of time. In our business, we talk about that all the time. In our business, we call them the founders' fundamentals. My father and Jay Van Andel had a set of ideas when they started our company that we talk about today with people all over the world. That those ideas stand the test of time and they reach across cultures and they connect across generations because people all over are still interested in these ideas of freedom, family, hope, and reward. That's what it was for us at Amway. I'm not going to try to articulate them for our scholars who are going to come here and do that for our country and talk about the things that they have here, but this set of principles that are ours. At the National Constitution Center, on the wall of the facility, it starts with "We, the people." This is our country. What are we going to do with it? How do we feel about it? How are we going to talk about it? How are we going to get our conversation to a place where we bring people together so everybody feels they have a sense of belonging, that they're connected to who we are and what we can achieve, and that we have hopes for the future? So we want to encourage you all as we do this to let's spend a little time getting our minds in the right frame. Just this mindset, a civics mindset, of just trying to understand each other, trying to have a better idea of why some of these things we talk about are important, what they really are, how they came to be, and why they're important for us today and for our future. So these are important things for us to think about and to work through. And while we're going to have amazing scholars and leaders who are incredibly thoughtful and studied in this, I want to remind all of us it's up to us, not just them. They play a role. They play a role to help us understand. But it's up to us to have the conversations wherever we go after this, whether you're going home, going to work, going to school, whatever the case may be, wherever you go, talk to somebody about what you learned today. Express a thought, a view, or something new that was different, something that challenged you, something that might be a little different than what you thought coming in here. And maybe you don't change your mind about it yet, but you at least explore another position, another view. And that's what these principles all talk about. So that's the work of the Bill of Rights Institute, and that's the work that we do at the National Constitution Center to help people take a step in their own journey at being an American. What do these ideas mean? And how do they bring us together from all these different backgrounds, from all the things that could divide us, and in some cases do, if we let them? But what are the ideas around which we can start to build a sense and momentum of agreement? Say, okay, I believe with you on that one. I may disagree on this or that, but okay, I'm with you. 10%, 20%, 50%. And we can start creating a pool of shared understanding, of shared meaning, and we can find a way to be together. And then we can find a way to work together, and we can find a way to be a better community, a better state, and a better country. And ultimately, have an opportunity to be better citizens. So that's what this is about. That's the framework that is in my mind as we do this, as you're here. I'm grateful that you're here. And this is the way to do it, just coming together. Doesn't need to be big stadiums, small groups, even smaller. Hopefully in the holidays, you can have good conversations without people storming out of the room. That was our conversation at church last Sunday, was about how to deal with family drama coming up over the holidays. So politics might be part of it. But does it have to be? Can we find a way to address issues that we may feel differently about but still find enough common understanding to bring us together. That's what our country's about. That's what we need. That's what we can achieve. So with that, I'm going to, just with that framework, invite you to enjoy the conversations that we're going to have, and just open your mind, enjoy, take it all in, and I trust you'll find this to be a good experience. Then I'll have a few comments as we wrap up. So, Stan, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first panel to discuss free speech in civil society. To do this, we're joined by two long-term leaders in the field, David Bobb and Greg Lukianoff. David Bobb joined the Bill of Rights Institute as president in 2013 and has worked for 20 years at the intersection of civic engagement and education reform. Having taught courses in American politics and public policy in the history and political science departments of Boston College and Hillsdale College, he was also the founding director of a national civic education program for high school teachers at Hillsdale, as well as the Alwyn P. Kirby Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Studies in Washington, D.C. David has designed online educational programs used by more than 500,000 participants and is a nationally recognized proponent of civic education that changes and engages the hearts and minds of students. He's the author of Humility, an unlikely biography of America's greatest virtue, and has written for Wall Street Journal and Fast Company, among many other publications. He earned his PhD in political science from Boston College, where he received fellowships from the Pew, Earhart, and Bradley Foundations. Greg Lukianoff currently serves as the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE for short. FIRE's mission is to defend and sustain individual rights of all Americans to free speech and free thought, the most essential ingredients of liberty. Since its founding, FIRE has done remarkable work protecting and expanding speech freedoms for students, and has recently announced a major expansion of its vital work, now going well beyond the campus. He's the co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. The book was a New York Times bestseller and was named one of Bloomberg's best books of 2018. You may have read his work in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or seen his appearances on the CBS Evening News, the Today Show, and even Dr. Phil. He has received degrees from American University and Stanford University. It's hard to imagine a person better suited to lead an organization devoted to the preservation of each person's right to speak and express themselves. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the president of the Bill of Rights Institute, David Bobb, and the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Mr. Greg Lukianoff.
I'm being here, probably?
Yes, please. Well, thank you, Stan, and thank you so much, Doug, for that great framing of our conversation today. We are so delighted to have this conversation with you all. You know, it's election day, but this is not a political event. We're here to talk about civics. We're here to talk about some of the core elements that make up a strong civic education. When you cast your ballot, you'll see a lot of titles. You'll see a lot of offices. We think of, even though it's an off-cycle election, the President of the United States, as lofty a title as we might ever conceive of in this country. But you know, there's a higher one. That's citizen. And we're here to celebrate and mark that and reflect on that. How is it that we can come together and build a strong civil society? We're in a building right now, the Ladies Literary Society, that had its purpose to talk about ideas. You know, some book clubs today start off with the premise that it ought to be people that already agree talking about a book, and they just confirm each other's biases. What if we had literary societies, organizations at the heart of our civil society, where people actually disagreed with one another and did that so as to sharpen each other? Today, I'm so glad to be joined by you, Greg, because what you're leading, I think, is one of the most important efforts in America. That is the revival, the focus on our ability as Americans not to eliminate disagreement, but to manage those disagreements that we have. You'll hear from others shortly who will join me about their work, and I'm excited for this conversation. Let's dig in though, Greg, and I'd like to just ask you first off, what is the greatest threat right now to free expression in the United States?
First of all, thanks so much for having me, Grand Rapids. Great to see Doug again. A huge fan of the Bill of Rights Institute. National Constitution Center, Jeff Rosen is here. So it's great to be among friends and people I have tremendous respect for. The greatest threat to free speech is always government, period. You know, our government, other people's governments, that's always the greatest threat to free speech. But currently, I would say something that interrelates with government is what is sometimes called cancel culture. I think right now, after, frankly, a very long and intentional project, particularly on campuses, there has been a switch in valence of freedom of speech, where once upon a time, for most of the time I was coming up, freedom of speech was seen as the quintessential value of people on the left or people who call themselves liberals. Now that flip has happened, and you can see this in polling, and we talk about it in Coddling of the American Mind, we're in a fairly precarious place. I am worried that if you're raised hearing that free speech is exclusively the argument of what I call the 3 Bs, the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron, you're going to grow up hostile to it. Now, of course, whenever I speak at high schools, I'm like, no, that's nonsense. The robber barons, rich and powerful tend to do well in most societies. And in a democracy, you only need freedom of speech to protect minority opinions, and they're never taught this. This doesn't come up sufficiently unless they're taking your classes or using fire material as well in K through 12. So I think that the erosion and misrepresentation of freedom of speech to young people is one of the biggest long-term threats I've seen in my career. And by the way, we all saw this coming in the 90s when I was in law school. I call it the slow motion train wreck that somehow we couldn't quite stop.
Yeah. Greg, you mentioned a book, The Coddling of the American Mind. I'd highly recommend it to all of you if you haven't had a chance to read it. What, in a nutshell, I know the title wasn't of your own devising,
right?
But what is it that you and your co-author Jonathan Haidt were getting at with the idea behind the coddling? You alluded it a minute ago, but maybe just elaborate on that if you would, please.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And what David is referring to is I have never liked the title because I think it will prevent people who really need to read it from reading it. They'll just say, all we're saying is you're just a bunch of spoiled brats. That is absolutely not what we're saying. I wanted to call it disempowered because what I think that we should understand is that older people are teaching the younger generation the habits of anxious and depressed people, the modes of thought of anxious and depressed people. And we saw this coming, I actually saw this coming way back in 2008, when you saw administrators mimicking ideas that I'd learned from my own struggles with anxiety and depression that are called cognitive distortions. The kind of thoughts that if they're too loud in your head, they will make you depressed, they will make you anxious. And these include things like catastrophizing, like binary thinking, everything is either good or evil. Fortune telling, the idea that you know exactly how things are going to pan out. But back in 2008, I said to myself, well, thank goodness the students aren't listening. The administrators are selling this distorted way of thinking, but students are ignoring it. And then right at the end of 2013 and through 2014, like lightning hit, and I think overwhelmingly coming through K through 12 schools, students started showing up on campus who not only were more hostile to freedom of speech, when they would talk about why they were more hostile to freedom of speech, they would give medicalized rationales for it that, as someone who is a free speech defender and someone who's struggled with anxiety and depression themselves, I was like, not only will this be a disaster for freedom of speech, this is going to be a disaster for mental health among these very same young people. If they actually believe that they're fragile, that they're easily harmed, that words can actually permanently damage them, you're setting them up for failure, as the second half of the title says. So we predicted this back in 2014. Haidt and I wrote the original article in 2015 in The Atlantic, and we were kind of expecting maybe we knew things were going to be worse for freedom of speech, and they certainly have been. But when it comes to how it worked out for mental health, we were expecting like a little scholarly, 6% decrease in mental health among younger people. And instead, it was a hockey stick. Like the amount of anxiety and depression, mood disorders, they doubled for young women, for example, from 2008 to 2017. The number of suicides also doubled around that same time. And it's really, I always hesitate to use the word crisis, but we are facing a mental health crisis on campus, partially because I believe we shouldn't be surprised because we're teaching young people, again, the habits of anxious and depressed people.
Yeah, that's a remarkable thing that we're all living right now. Greg, you have taken that picture and you have provided an antidote in the book. What, in short, is the best way to redress that problem? You pointed to cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
That's a big part of it.
Yep.
But what are some of the practical things? We have some high school students that are joining us today that one can do if you're trying to guard against this kind of temptation.
Yeah. Well, I wish there was some short, easy answer. And we talk about a lot of potential solutions at the end of Coddling of the American Mind. I do think teaching people about CBT really early on is helpful. But when it comes to simple things that I think need to be introduced to students much earlier on, yes, they need to learn civics, absolutely. They also need to learn that if someone is telling you that you are fragile and you will be permanently damaged by words, don't listen to them. The research there is very clear. People aren't fragile, particularly young people. They're resilient. And someone who's actually telling you that you should prime yourself to assume you're fragile, that's the only way you actually self-fragilize yourself. And that's why I wanted to call it disempowered, is because I do think that we're doing something really, even though a lot of the people who espouse these ideas of care, they're doing something that frankly I think is quite cruel. It's the equivalent of whispering into your child's ear constantly as they're growing up, be careful because you can't really handle life on your own, that you will be permanently harmed, that you aren't powerful, and then being surprised that they don't feel powerful.
One of the things that Doug Devos mentioned in his opening remarks is that civics needs to become more of a mindset. You pointed, Greg, to the essential quality of civics, and what we see at the Bill of Rights Institute is that it's not just a course. Some of you in the audience today may have had a course in high school that bore that name, civics. When you take it as a mindset, what you're really doing is a kind of habituation towards the mindset that you're resilient, that you should have conversation with people. You should invite, in fact, not be afraid of views that are different than yours. Yep. And in that sense, it can't be, if we are to develop the habits of heart and mind that are necessary to regain what it means to be an American, we're going to have to regain that ability to want people to disagree with you. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe give us a taste of something to come?
Yeah.
Which is that your next book will be talking about the canceling of the American mind.
Yes.
So we've moved from a certain coddling to now a full-on canceling. What's at work with that? And again, what are some of the things that we can do to build up that resiliency against this kind of encroaching culture?
Absolutely, and I did want to give a shout out again to your book, Humility, because this is a very underappreciated aspect of American liberty, is how much it's based on, the only fancy word I use all the time, which is epistemic humility, by which I mean intellectual / knowledge about what you can know. But one thing that I feel very lucky, there's a million different reasons why I feel very lucky to be an American, why my parents came to this country in the first place, is that our founding fathers were actually surprisingly good, actually amazingly good social psychologists, just like my co-author Jonathan Haidt. And they understood that in the grand scheme of things, approaching that you can't live in a successful democratic society where everybody is so arrogant to assume that they are always right. Being part of democracy, you have to take seriously the fact that you might be wrong. And actually, to be honest, we're wrong all the time. So I do think that the humility is a very important part of the story. So canceling of the American Mind, which makes my heart jump a little bit because I'm supposed to hand the book in January, but it's going really well. Believe it or not, I'm co-authoring it with a 22-year-old, a genius named Rikki Schlott. She writes for the New York Post. I met her when she was 20. She dropped out of school after reading Coddling the American Mind, and she found me in Height to tell us that everything you say in this book is completely correct, and what can I do to help? I wouldn't have expected to co-author a book with her until I found out that I could throw her even my most intellectual stuff. I could send her 20 articles. I'm like, okay, well, summarize this accurately. And to my great embarrassment, she would come back with a summary of it that was exactly what I was saying, just in fewer words. So amazingly impressed. So canceling of the American Mind. I was originally planning to write something that was much more expansive as a follow-up to Coddling in the American Mind, much more based on psychology. Height's writing the foreword to this forthcoming book. But when it comes to cancel culture, the idea that I still have people who are trying to tell me that cancel culture, particularly on Twitter, doesn't even exist is outrageous. And I wanted to put all the data in one place to point out that it's not just, not only does it exists at such a scale, we're going to be studying this stuff in 50 to 100 years. So I try to put this in historical perspective. We dug really hard into McCarthyism, 1947 to 1957 roughly, and the number of professors who were fired for being pro-communist. It works out that the reliable numbers are between 100 and 130. And meanwhile, cancel culture, even though we're not facing a national security threat, even though American and British spies didn't just give Stalin the bomb, which I can understand why the country was a little freaked out, that we're seeing numbers way past that. At this point, we are at about 800 attempts to get professors fired or suspended. When it comes to step down or fired, there's about 250 of them fired, but an even larger number of those professors are either suspended or censored or required to go through ideological training. So we're really trying to put the argument in one place that this is really happening. And the second one that you'll definitely appreciate is that we argue in a terrible way. We argue like grade schoolers. We do a lot of, I think that's not a coincidence. It's partially because we've literally adopted some of the habits that people have in 8th grade and transported them into cancel culture because they work really well at quote unquote winning arguments without actually winning arguments. So one thing that we're really going to point to, which is much simpler to fix, is we don't have to argue like this anymore.
Yeah, that's really profound. I'm going to give you a question here that's from our audience. Aiden asks a great question. And in framing this, I'd like just to note that if we see disempowerment as that first thing, that kind of coddling, we also see the cancellation. There's another C at work here, and that's the chilling or chilled expression, right? So when we work with teenagers at the Bill of Rights Institute, what they often tell us is that they feel nervous, almost like they're walking on eggshells, to talk about things that are controversial, particularly in class, but also just with their friends. Doug, you talked about, here we have the holidays coming up. They say at Thanksgiving, you shouldn't talk about religion and politics, right? But what else really, is more fun to talk about than those things, after all?
Oh, comic books.
And sure, that's important too. But for young people, there's this dread sense that we see reported on over and over again. And we see it at lots of other age demographics in our country too, where we're just seeing a diminution of those conversations that really matter. And we have chilled speech, and we say we're not going to do it. So the thing that kids worry about, oftentimes, when it comes to negative polarization is, can I talk and keep my friendships if I bring up these tough subjects? And so Aiden asks, what does this look like in a conversation where one member of a friend group has differing ideas from the others? Maybe you could take us to a really concrete place where, how can you do this in a way where those friendships are held intact and you still build in those tough conversations? Yeah,
I wish I could once again offer a simple solution, but this is something that's badly underappreciated, is the extent to which social media has undermined interpersonal trust. Now, what do I mean by that? And we see story after story like this. Fire interns are, the kind of interns we have at Fire are absolutely amazing, truly gifted, exceptional kids. And they also tend to have a bit of optimism about them. But I remember talking to them as a group last summer, and it was all great and positive. And then I asked them about what the environment was for cancel culture in K through 12, and all of them start looking very grave. And they start talking about friends that they had, friends that other friends had, where they think they were just talking within a group, but what happened, and just among each other, that one of their friends would run off, one of their friends would run off, and if they heard something that you said, they'd interpret it in the most uncharitable way, and then get status points essentially for themselves by reporting on you, telling their friends, like, I'm so much more moral than this person because can you believe that they said this thing? Oftentimes, it's not even what the person actually said, and sometimes it's just, can you imagine being held to account for every dumb thing you said in K through 12? So I do think that cancel culture has really undermined interpersonal trust. Now, how can you start to work and gain that back? And what's funny is, I get asked by conservatives a lot to talk about safe spaces on campus. And I ask Neil deGrasse Tyson this. It's like, well, which of the 8 different definitions of safe spaces do you mean? Because some of them are just affinity groups where you agree with each other. Other times it's like when my friend Nicholas Christakis got in trouble at Yale, they were using what we say is safe spaces as a sword to say that him and his wife Erica didn't belong at Yale because they were challenging students to what they think. But meanwhile, I always give a defense of what safe spaces meant when I was coming up. And it's very simple. It meant a place where it was safe to actually be yourself and that people wouldn't go narc on you. It was a place it was safe to actually talk about difficult things where someone isn't going to run out and try to get you canceled. So I do think that having conversations, like the importance of having off-the-record conversations where people can be honest. Oh, but I did want to add one other thing about chilled speech, which is really important to understand. Right now, people are falsifying their preferences, as Timur Karan, who's on our board of advisors, would say. People are pretending to believe things that they don't because they're too afraid of getting canceled for saying the wrong thing. And this leads to what's called a pluralistic ignorance, also known as the Emperor's Clothes paradox, but I think Todd Rose says it the best, a collective illusion. That when you poll people individually, people are much more moderate and much more heterodox in what they think. But when you poll them based on what they think other people think, it's much more polarized. So we do currently have a situation where people aren't being honest with each other, partially because they're terrified of being canceled by, in some cases, even their own friends.
So this leads us to having identified some major problems here. Greg, you pointed us to a few solutions. Could you just say a little bit about the expansion you're leading at Fire? Because I think this is so vital for everyone to understand that there is an organization dedicated to not just doing this on America's college campuses where the need is so critical, but now in this enlarged purview that you all are taking, you're going to be looking at the question of individual rights and expression across the whole of our society. What's that going to entail? What are some of the things that you see as first things that you need to tackle in this new work?
Absolutely, and great question. We were actually planning to announce that we were expanding off campus on April 18th of next year, but things got so bad in the larger society that we decided to just go for it, and even though we weren't fully staffed up yet, to announce that we were moving from being the Foundation for Individual Rights and in Education to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression on June 6th of this year, because the need was just so dire. And the 3 ways in which we're growing first, because for most of our existence, it was just higher education. Now, people had been approaching us from and right, left, and center, asking us to take the role as the national defender of freedom of speech for as long back as I can remember. But campuses are too important, would be my answer, that focusing on campuses was too important. But we needed to be at a level, but I did leave out the possibility that if we could get to a level of coverage on campus, where I felt like we were sufficiently covering the problem on campus, where we were producing great data about what schools you should and shouldn't go to, and we do a very rigorous free speech ranking of schools, which I encourage everybody in this room to look at. It's multifactorial. Before you go to particular colleges, like don't go to Syracuse, for example. You might want to reconsider Yale, and University of Chicago does actually poll as well as you would think. But once we had that level of coverage, it seemed that we were destined to be the group, and I know that sounds grandiose, but within FIRE, we're all true believers of free speech. We are genuinely politically diverse, but we wanted to expand this to the rest of the country. So we're expanding first in 3 ways. The research department is growing, and that's directly under me, and that's partially so that we can have good data and then figure out how we can actually use that in our education efforts in things like coddling the American mind, canceling the American mind, scholarly articles. We are tripling the size of our litigation, and now we're taking litigation department, and we're taking cases off campus. But the single most important part of it is recruiting our 1 million strong free speech army. What do we mean by that? What we mean there is that if we really do want to be the defenders of not just free speech in terms of the First Amendment, but free speech culture, which is one of the things that makes us different, we're going to be taking on, for example, big corporations like PayPal that is actually trying to clamp down on speech on the basis of viewpoint. We're not going to win a litigation in that, but we know that people will actually be angry when they find out what's going on, but it won't matter that much unless you have enough emails, unless you have enough Twitter followers, unless you have enough Facebook followers. And so we wanted to build that 1 million man army over the course of the next 3 years. And I've got really good news for you. We had about 30,000 email addresses from FIRE's entire career around this time last year, which I thought was actually pretty good. We now have 260,000 just in the past year. We have blown way past our goals on social media where you can reach younger people, on TikTok. Instagram in particular, our Instagram game is super strong. I'm excited about that. And that's not me, that's the younger people at FIRE who are good at it. And so I think we're going to blow way past the 1 million people that we're trying to add. That's been thanks so much to partners, including people like Doug, who have been so supportive of us. The goal was to raise $75 million over the next 3 years, and we only started this around this time last year. We're already at 40 million. But we still got a ways to go. Of course, looking at that other 35 when I feel like we're just about to head into possibly a recession has me a little bit anxious. But I really do believe we'll get there.
Great, that's really exciting. I'm going to ask a few questions from Slido, and please, if you have others, keep them coming. Chris asks this: how does the decline of a productive political discourse impact the ability for the rest of us to engage meaningfully? Raises the question of the causal arrow. Are we influenced? Is it kind of downstream from political discourse that we've seen these problems, or what is the relationship, Craig?
Well, like a lot of things, particularly in social science, it's a feedback loop. That essentially, when people realize that it's much easier to get media coverage for saying oversimplified, outrageous, or outrage-producing things, they tend to gravitate more that way. And when people hear that being as the majority, the discussion is covered by the media, it leads them to believe that we don't really talk about serious things within politics. So it reinforces this really low quality of debate and discussion. And I have to say, the media plays a huge role in that. I've been so painfully disappointed at some of the media institutions that I used to really trust. That's one of the reasons why I'm excited about lots of experimentation also in the media space, where they're trying to actually get out of the way of themselves and report news as factually accurately as possible without actually showing their hats about kind of like what the particular journalist feels about that news, which shouldn't really matter all that much anyway. So I do think that we are seeing a negative feedback loop that greatly lowers the the productivity of our overall national dialogue, and that's both reflected by and reinforces our politics, unfortunately.
Great. John asks this: to be able to argue well, what's the best form of education? Classical, maybe, since it emphasizes rhetoric?
Yep. Well, what's the best form of education for arguing well? I'm a big believer in having one area in which you're super deep. So my area that I spent a lot of my time cultivating, of course, is First Amendment constitutional law. But I'm also, a nerd who, when I was in high school, very much hid the fact that I was a big defensive tackle who would sneak down to the Danbury Public Library every Sunday to go read microfilms and read books down there, because I didn't want anybody to know I was one of those people who read for, who read for fun. I think having a deep knowledge in one area, go really deep with the thing that you, and I want to be clear here, this sounds like it's silly advice, unserious advice. Go deep with the thing that you actually love. Like I tell people about this when they're going to college. Study the thing that you would study even if you weren't getting a degree in it, because you will always be better in that topic than anyone else because you love it. But then start expanding out. And I do think that some of the most interesting ways to argue right now, they're not just legal arguments. They're arguments that actually, just like the Founding Fathers did, they incorporated science, they incorporated psychology, they incorporated history and ancient wisdom. So it's that multidisciplinary way of arguing that I actually think makes the best arguers. But I do want to say one thing that has been a genuine surprise in my own career, because I wouldn't have necessarily seen this coming. Yes, debate is great. I love debate, it's important. If I could wave a magic wand, I would require every junior in America to do a debate where they had to take the other side from what they actually believe. Because I think once you take the other side, it's very hard to dismiss your opponents as simply being stupid or evil, which is what we do way too much. So I do believe very much in debate. But I've really come around to some of these listening projects. Some of these projects where you have people who are from very different walks of life, they get to know each other, and you're not trying to correct them. You're trying to really genuinely figure out where they're coming from. There have been projects, for example, that have taken people from rural Kentucky and brought them to high schools in the Bronx, and they will have two people talk to each other with the idea that by the end of the day that you can describe yourself, you can describe the other person as if they were yourself. That the person from Kentucky, will explain what it's like to be that one individual that they met from the Bronx, and vice versa. It's moving, but it also creates a sense of empathy, which is sorely lacking in our politics today. So I really do love listening projects as well.
Yeah, that is so important. I found that to be true when I was in the classroom, that to be able to ask students to take that role, very different than their own, represented in a way that would be recognizable, that builds such strong connective tissue.
And trust.
It builds trust, and it ties in, Greg, to the last question that I want to ask you in this way. We are here in America on Election Day. You cite an interesting, and one might say even unusual source in your book, The Coddling of the American Mind. You go to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and you say this, in quoting Solzhenitsyn, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Our tendency, especially here on Election Day, is to be us versus them. Can you talk just a little bit as you wrap, please? What does that word from Solzhenitsyn mean to us today, and what charge would you give us as we go forward?
Solzhenitsyn is especially dear to my heart because I often point out my grandfather, not my great-great-grandfather, my grandfather fought in the Bolshevik Revolution. And I hate to break it to you, but we lost. And we are what would later be called kulaks. We were people who were serfs, serfs who made good. And so that, the experience of Soviet Russia and then the horrors of that is something that every young person, must learn. But what does it mean today is that one thing that I was very proud of as someone who used to write fiction, as someone who's has wide-ranging interests, I was impressed that our art as a country was becoming more sophisticated. We started watching shows like Mad Men and Breaking Bad and all of these kind of things where the main character is not a paragon of virtue. Partially because we were starting to understand that there is, goodness, as my father would say, that there's beauty and ugliness in everybody, and it's important to actually understand where people come from. So I felt like, as far as being folk behavioral psychologists, we were becoming more and more sophisticated as the years went by. And unfortunately, we've gone right back to what we call the third great untruth in Coddling the American Mind, that life is just a battle between good people and evil people, and that's it. I think we can find our way back to a situation when we know that when we're arguing with someone that we can understand, just like my father would say, that there's something ugly, of course, which is not in their beliefs, but there's also something beautiful, that it's not as simple as good versus evil. And if we're going to have that epistemic humility that makes democracy work, we must look for the best of others and try to explain and try to question the problems within ourselves.
Greg Lukianoff, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. It's great.
Thank you, Greg and David, for that enlightening discussion. I'll again remind you, please do feel free to get up and move about if you need to, get a drink, whatever will help you feel comfortable and enjoy the balance of our time this morning. Our second panel is going to focus on civil discourse in civic education, the thing that BRI does all day, every day. The practical reality and tremendous significance of these skills, as you just heard from Greg, cannot be overestimated. To discuss that, we are grateful to be joined by Nichelle Pinkney. Nichelle comes to us with 17 years of experience as a social studies educator, working as a teacher, coach, curriculum writer, and professional development trainer. She currently works as the Social Studies Instructional Officer for the Klein Independent School District, a district of more than 50,000 students located outside of Houston, Texas. She is the co-author of the just-released book, Civil Discourse, Classroom Conversations for Stronger Communities, which is published by Corwin Press earlier this year, and with her co-author, who is one of our staff at the Bill of Rights Institute. We're delighted and pleased to have that book out and contributing to the conversation in classrooms. Hear from your local Grand Valley State University. The social studies professor there, Dr. Annie Whitlock, says that Nichelle's book, quote, lays a foundation for how to have civil discourse in all classrooms, not just social studies ones. This book highlights civil discourse as a life skill. Joining Nichelle and David, we're delighted to have with us Jeff Rosen, who is the president of the National Constitution Center, and a renowned legal scholar on constitutional issues. He leads the National Constitution Center located in Philadelphia. You heard referenced a couple of times already today, which is engaged with millions of citizens on a nonpartisan basis, providing resources for constitutional understanding and civics education. He also serves as a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and is a contributing editor for The Atlantic. He's written multiple books, including books on Supreme Court Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Louis Brandeis, as well as President William Howard Taft. To join David Bobb for a conversation about civil discourse and civic education, please join me in welcoming to the platform Nichelle Pinkney and Jeff Rosen.
So if we can see that. Thank you so much, Nichelle, Jeff. So glad that we can jump in and continue this robust conversation. Nichelle, I'm going to start with a question for you. You have a lot of experience in the classroom. Tell us, what's happening now to be an American classroom teacher in social studies, talking about things that are controversial.
Well, so I would hope. Let's say what I would hope. So today, I hope that everyone is having conversations and everyone is telling students how it's their parents' rights, it's their rights if they're 18 or older to be voting. But in some communities, I know that that's not the case. I have teachers who are even afraid to even cover the election, which is almost more of a disservice than covering it to me, because it's the foundation of what America was built upon. I used to tell students all the time that we wouldn't have America if students like them did not stand up. And so because of that, I think in our country, similar to what Greg just said, that we are at a point where it's either black or white, and there's no in between. And black and white meets at one point, and it creates other colors and other shades that we like to express and look at. And so in America's schools today, we need to embrace that in the middle and be able to understand that it's okay, because all can exist at one time.
That's a beautiful message, and I'd like to stop and just reiterate something that Stan said at the beginning of this program, which is that the work that we're doing as an organization in this state, in Michigan, is made possible by Dick and Ethy Hayworth. I'm really grateful. They couldn't be with us today, but I'm really grateful for what they've done, because we saw an example of what you just spoke about last month. In Detroit, we had, since the pandemic hit our country, the largest gathering of teachers when we do professional development programs. 35 teachers gathered and talked about what it means to be an American. They addressed all of the hot button issues that you could imagine. And that concern that you just expressed was top of mind for them. It is nearly impossible, given the fact that principals in our buildings, superintendents, and the number one challenge is parents who say, avoid those topics because of, well, there's a multitude of reasons. You've written a book, though, that addresses these things and helps empower teachers, citizens, really any American, to engage in the art of civil discourse. I'd recommend it to all of you. It's a great read. It's very practical, but I wonder, Nichelle, if you could just tell us, why did you write this book with Joe Schmidt?
So this is gonna sound cliche coming from a teacher, but it's the honest to God truth. It was because of the students in my class. Even when I came in today, I was drawn to the students that were here. I was like, hi, how are y'all doing? I introduced myself to almost half of them because I wanted my students to understand. I grew up in a community a marginalized community. People did not vote. They complain. Everything is against them. And so when I started teaching, I went back home to teach. And it was really weird because I went back home to teach because I was a broke college student. But I did not realize that when I went back, I was doing something that most people looked at as a good thing. Like, they were like, you came back. And so I came back to the community that I grew up in, that I was privileged enough to go away to college from, and came back, and that was what I taught my students, that we are a marginalized community by choice. And they would ask, what does that mean? And I would say, we don't vote, so we have no voices. And to do that, we have to be educated. And so educating my students meant then educating them meant they educated their parents. In the book, I actually talk about, in my acknowledgments, I acknowledge that I wouldn't have been able to write this because if it wasn't for those thousands of students that I was able to do all of this with, teaching them how we all have different views, making my students debate the topics that they didn't want to debate from the sides that they completely and utterly disagree with. But it was to build a foundation for them to understand another side. So I wrote this book for the students of those communities that felt like they didn't have a voice and what that looks like. And then working with Joe was just like that balance of two different places and coming together at one point to see something beautiful. We wrote this during the pandemic via social media, and the world around us was different for all people. But the most joyous thing to me was seeing people come together and say, enough is enough.
I want to return in a minute to empathy, which Greg Lukianoff mentioned, and you've thought a lot about, and it's one of the core building blocks of your program, really, for civil discourse. But Jeffrey Rosen, you're one of America's leading legal scholars. You've been a defender of the First Amendment in all of its facets for a good deal of time. Sometimes we get the impression that those who defend the First Amendment must somehow stand alienated from civil discourse because it allows all of those things that are the farthest thing from civil. There must be something problematic about the First Amendment. Could you try to explain how it is that you can be a robust defender of the First Amendment and yet be in favor of civil discourse?
I can't explain it better than Greg. That was a wonderful vision of exactly why it's necessary to defend free speech and have epistemic humility in order to change your mind and live freely. But I think what you want to say to people is defending the speech of those we hate, as Holmes said, is not the end of the discussion, it's the beginning of it. It's because we don't trust the government or trust our fellow citizens to decide in advance who can speak and who can be heard, that we have to draw such a firm line. And Greg and Fire are so heroic in reminding America that the core of the free speech tradition is, in America, you can only ban speech if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. That's how high the bar is. Go shoot Jeff now. At this point in the breakfast, I'm tired, I want to go home, kill him now. That could be banned, definitely. But short of that, no. And that makes us the most speech protective country in the world. No other country, no other Western democracy sets such a high bar. And it's dramatically under threat. But that's not the end of the discussion, it's the beginning. It's only because we allow the speech we hate that we can take the time to listen to each other and have confidence that truth will emerge from the marketplace of ideas. So take the debate about Twitter. I thought that Elon Musk was right, that Twitter shouldn't moderate. As the leading speech platform in America, Twitter should, I thought, voluntarily embrace First Amendment standards and not be in the business of content moderation. But that doesn't mean that Twitter is going to be a productive place for discussion. Not that it was before Elon Musk. But to allow raucous, thoughtless, impetuous tweets is the antithesis of the thoughtful deliberation that Michelle is describing so movingly and that all of us are in the business of creating. So to have a real conversation, you have to bring together people who disagree. And you have to take time to listen to each other, as we're doing here in this literary society, this temple of reason. I love the Greek and Roman classical images. And what a reminder that in Michigan in the 19th century, people thought it was important to build a space of reason. I mean, it's so beautiful and devoted to the idea of learning and listening from each other. So that's why I think it's it's a really good question, David, to ask. So we have to do at least two things as defenders of speech and liberty and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. First, say, here's how little speech can be regulated. But second, say, well, then let's make an extra effort to make sure that the conversations are thoughtful, are moderated, are civil. People take the time to listen to each other. And then, as Doug said, if we don't change our minds, and we really do, at least we'll be open to the arguments on the other side.
Jeff, you lead the National Constitution Center. Among the programs that you have done, and I think have helped blaze a trail, is constitutional conversations, in which some of those things that Greg talked about are built into young people in high school talking to one another. Could you talk just a little bit about that program and what fruits you've seen come from it and what promise you see for those kind of listening exchanges in the future?
It is such an inspiring model. Greg had mentioned bringing rural and urban kids or adults together to talk, and we tried it before COVID on Zoom, uniting classrooms in Philadelphia and Florida and trying to get geographic and other diversity. And we'd set for these students a common question, and there were ground rules for the conversation. At the beginning, we asked people to separate their political from their constitutional views, asking not what the government should do, but what the Constitution allowed or forbade it from doing. And then we asked that they listen to arguments on both sides of the constitutional question before making up their own minds. So, for example, a good place to begin with kids is often the Fourth Amendment. Can the government search your backpack or, more saliently, can Google follow you around 24/7 and use your cell phone data to reconstruct your movements in public? A great question. It's kind of open before the Supreme Court, and it obviously affects all of our lives. So we set a question like that for the kids and bring out the arguments on each side, and they had to read the text of the Fourth Amendment and listen to the leading case law about it, including the story of John Wilkes in England who criticized King George. And then we'd listen to what scholars on either side had said about it, and then they would vote before and after. And it was marvelous to see kids from very different backgrounds talking about it. And of course, it didn't line up in any predictable ways. People within each classroom and between them had different views. It tended to break party boundaries, and everyone learned something. So that's a wonderful model. Now, after COVID hit, of course, you couldn't bring together people live in classrooms, so we just started teaching on Zoom one-on-one. I taught some classes, and my great colleague, Curry Sautner, taught classes, and took questions in the Zoom chat. That was wonderful. My favorite moment there was, I always insisted, I want you to read the majority opinions and the dissents before making up your mind. And one kid texted in the Zoom chat, I'm Sam, I'm 8, I'm not sure I can read the dissents. So I know you can do it, Sam. And they can, and people, it's amazing. Kids in middle school will rise to the challenge, because if you just take time and give people the confidence to know all the power that all of us have in us to focus and open our minds, than they do. So that was great. And now we're live sometimes, but also archiving the chats. And the crucial thing here, the point is what we're talking about as we try to imagine these conversations. First, who's talking? And second, what are they talking about? So if you can't bring together classrooms from different parts of the country within a single classroom, it's very important to expose people to different points of view and to bring together liberal and conservative and libertarian scholars, teachers, and moderators so that people can be exposed to all the arguments. So here the curriculum is important, and the Bill of Rights Institute is such a leader in primary text, and you're so correct that by presenting people the text and allowing them to speak for themselves, you cut through the partisanship and get to the heart of the matter. And we at the Constitution Center, we're so excited to partner with you, and teacher training workshops and other things are also putting primary texts online. But in addition to that, we have competing and debating scholars to guide the discussions. So our interactive Constitution brings together leading liberal and conservative scholars to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. So if the kids are discussing the Fourth Amendment, they can see Barry Friedman and Orrin Kerr, nominated by the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society, exploring areas of agreement and disagreement. And that's a great guide. And then we have these wonderful podcasts, which every week bring together liberals and conservatives for thoughtful discussions. So I'm raising this to say it's crucially important, who's talking, and at best you can have a really diverse group of people from different backgrounds, but also to make sure that the topics of conversation and the teaching materials themselves present all sides.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is so vital, because a key part about we the people is we the students, right? And young people oftentimes are kind of intimidated by this process even. And Michelle, you talk about the steps that teachers can take and others. There are 4 building blocks that you point us to in your book about building civil discourse. They are courage, understanding, belonging, and empathy. I wonder if you could just say a few words about the courage part and then also the empathy part.
Okay. So the first part about courage is the idea that students should be able, actually someone asked the question earlier, how do I have that conversation when I'm in a group that obviously my friend may not agree, I already know, but I have this different view. That's the courage part right there. That is the part about being able to say, I don't agree with that because, and this is why I don't agree with that. I respect what you're saying, the empathy. I hear what you're saying, but I disagree because this reason and this reason. And so really building that foundation in our students to have courage to know they do have a voice. Their voices can be heard, but how we use that voice to respect others gives that empathy part about understanding that the perfect example, we have that discussion, we leave here and everyone still has their same view, but you have something in the back of your head that's like, but when they said that, it made me think, even though I still believe what I believe, and that part is okay. And so really letting students understand that it is okay to disagree. It is okay that you and your friends don't have the same view. Actually, that probably is what makes you better friends, that you have those different views because it allows you to see the windows of other lives.
I'm just imagining tonight as you're watching election returns and the pundits are on, just how much you're going to hear that, right? I hear what you're saying, but I believe, right? I mean, we're not used to that kind of language, that kind of thought, that kind of habit. How do you see the project? You've had the book now out. You've done a lot of work. Joe Schmidt at the Bill of Rights Institute does a lot of work. I know the National Constitution Center. There's institutional work that's being done. How are teachers kind of feeling? You gave us a little bit of a picture at how hard it is to teach contentious topics. Do they feel like this is a doable thing? And maybe you could address the role that parents play in this, because our teachers tell us often that it's the parents who actually want to, and this ties into a couple of questions that have been asked on Slido, that the parents want to kind of shut the conversations down.
Yeah. So the biggest thing I would say is we have to change the narrative. So my first statement is to teachers. We have to change the narrative. And as a teacher, the narrative of my classroom, the narrative of your classroom, parents, their issue is of a distrust. So when I distrust someone, the only way that I can get their trust back is allowing them to see that their distrust is not warranted. And I think because of the fear of whatever backlash, teachers have gotten to a point where their walls are up even higher than they were before. So the first thing I would say to teachers is take the wall down, change the narrative. So the narrative is whatever's being taught in the classroom, this is what it is. How do you change that? No, that is not what we're teaching in our class. I would love for you to come to this day when we're discussing, I'm going to use the Fourth Amendment because you just used it. We're going to be discussing the Fourth Amendment in search and seizure. I would love to have you come and participate in our conversation. Here are the resources that we have given students to read. We're annotating these resources in class. Please feel free to annotate, or I can give you an example of my annotation if you don't have time. I would love for you to come in. Here's a Zoom link if you would like to participate in the conversation. So it changes the narrative, because at this point we're saying this is not what we're doing in schools, but no one is really opening the door to say, hey, come in, let's show you what is going on in school, what we are doing great. And I talk about that in the book, about how my doors were open. And my principal was like, are you serious? You really want parents coming in? Yes, I want them coming in, because maybe then they'll register and maybe they'll vote then. So yeah, come on in, hear this conversation. To parents, I would say, become your teacher's friend. The narrative is not every classroom in America, right? And so learn that teacher in that classroom that your child sits in and be that advocate. If you want more conversations about different things, then help come in with those conversations. I would love to be a participant, because the first thing that teachers think is parents don't want to be involved or they're against them. So the first thing you do is you set up that window to say, I am not against you. I believe that you are a highly educated, highly qualified individual to instruct my kid, and I can't wait to be a part of your classroom. And that's the piece I think we're missing, and I think that's the piece that teachers are afraid of, superintendents are afraid of, parents are afraid of, to just open the doors and be like, hey, this is what we're doing. And stick to what you're doing. Don't change it. The conversation of what my opinion may be shouldn't be in my classroom. No one should know. I was a government teacher for 10 years. And you could probably call those kids and they would be like, we have no idea how she voted. They had no concept of how I voted, because in my classroom, it represented every issue that was on that ballot. And because I didn't want to make anybody feel different, this is what it is. I had shirts from every candidate, posters. I mean, it was like election headquarters for everybody in my classroom. But it was supposed to be like that. In a classroom, it's supposed to be like that. They are not supposed to know how you feel, per se, but they're supposed to know how to get the information to become that civic leader that we want them to become. And so I say to the parents, learn and engage with those teachers. And I say with the teachers, change the narrative. It's time for us to change the narrative.
That is such a powerful, absolutely. Nichelle, that is such a powerful prescription for what ails America. I think it points to a kind of renegotiated social compact. It says that we have to rebuild those bonds of trust, but they can be rebuilt. I would ask now, one of our Slido questions has from Dave, is there a cause for optimism? And as we wrap up this portion of our program, Jeff, I'd like you, if you would please, say a few words about that. Nichelle, you just painted some portrait of what steps we can do, but what do you anchor on right now to see that thing that you just so beautifully laid out is possible? Jeff?
Of course there's a cause for optimism. We just heard it. What beautiful words. And I love what you said. I can't wait to teach your child because I know about the potential that they have. That faith in the individual and confidence that they can rise to the challenge is a cause for optimism. Discussions like this are a cause for optimism. Look how we're learning from each other in this beautiful and meaningful space. And the cause for optimism I have is every single constitutional conversation I have, whether it's a podcast or a class with middle or high school kids, or here in Grand Rapids talking to the economics leaders. Every time you bring people together and create some thoughtful ground rules so everyone's confident that they can be heard and that they can learn. That's the crucial thing, to learn and grow together and be guided by reason, not by anger and emotion. When you set the right platform, it's remarkable. People who thought that they were different find that they're empathizing with each other because we're learning from each other. The other incredible cause for optimism, we've seen that the terrible, polarizing, dangerous qualities of the internet, and those statistics about the kids in psychology are very, very sobering. But on the other hand, think of the fact that all of the books and learning of the world are now free and available in our pockets. Think about the fact that these women in Michigan in the 19th century had to build this brick and mortar temple and carefully brought out all of these beautiful images. I mean, it's so moving to think about the work that they designed just to create a space for deliberation. And we, with the click of a button or a mouse, can find the original editions of these prints. We could find them within moments. Or the books that Thomas Jefferson read to inspire him about the meaning of the pursuit of happiness. Or it just blows my mind how exciting that is. All we have to do is take the time to find it and to read it. And that's why the theme of our panel and your virtues are so excellent. The burden is on us, on the individual, to develop those civic habits, the culture, to take the time to read and not to tweet. That simple, radical act of learning and discipline. The world is all before us. And it's a choice every moment of the day. And we all know that we have it every moment of the day. Are we going to browse and tweet, or are we going to read and learn? And it's difficult because the browsing is easier and more immediately gratifying. So let's not be holier than anyone else about how hard this is. But you develop the habits, and then you have that feeling of being your best self. And once you start feeling that habit, that it's better to delay the immediate gratification and learn and resist the impulse to be angry and to lash out, and instead to listen, to demonstrate those habits of humility, then you can do it better. It's a lifelong learning process, and these are habits of virtue. You're absolutely right to put it that way. So absolutely, I'm optimistic. There's so much to look forward to.
Thank you, Jeff. Nichelle?
Well, I am 100% optimistic because I'm an educator and I see the brilliant minds that come through our schools. I see my nieces and nephews and see that they know things that I didn't even know at their age. Like the children that we have in schools are so brilliant and so smart, partially because everything is at their fingertips. They don't have to get the huge Britannicas and do research. See, I'm giving my age a little bit here. I remember those days. They get to click and see things. And we wouldn't be true Americans if we didn't see that optimism. See, I think a lot of people forget that people do so much to come here because of those freedoms we have. They do so much to come here. My great-grandmother is Trinidadian, and she did her citizenship in 1989. She came across on a boat to come here because she was optimistic about that dream. I live in Texas. There are people, despite what people may believe or with Border Patrol, that come across the border for optimistic reasons to have something different, to believe in something different, to be a part of something that's different. And so if people can risk their lives to come to this place, why can't the people that were given the privilege and liberty to be born here not have that same optimism about the place that they live in and believe in? And so I am very optimistic, otherwise we wouldn't be the country we are and we wouldn't have the foundations that we do have. And those steps take just to realize where we are and how thankful we are to be here.
It's a great place to wrap. Thank you very much to both of you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nichelle, Jeff, and David. And thank you to all of you for taking the time again to be with us this morning. Before turning the microphone back to Doug for his concluding remarks, I again wish to express our thanks to our speakers. Please join me in thanking Greg Lukianoff, Nichelle Pinkney, and Jeff Rosen, David Bobb for joining us. We've heard from great observers of American culture today. Nearly 200 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville came from France to this country, and he saw two technologies at work, and at first he thought it was weird, and he didn't take it seriously. And the two things he saw were American conversation and American association. The way we talk to each other, the way we join together to solve problems. We all have this kind of technology in our pockets, but what we've just done here today is the stuff that's going to make the difference tomorrow. We invite you to continue the conversation with each other, to continue it with us at the Bill of Rights Institute. We thank the staff and those here at the catering staff, everyone who's helped taking care of us today. And again, to Kevin Hart, my other colleagues at BRI for putting the details of the event together. Please join me in thanking them as well. Finally, as he began our framing, we invite Doug back to the microphone to conclude us for the day. And we wish you a wonderful and successful election day today, but more importantly, a successful and active, vibrant American conversation tomorrow. Thank you.
Well, I just have a couple closing thoughts to go with, because every time you do an event like this, it's like, okay, now what do we do? All right, yeah. We've heard these sorts of things, now what do we do? Well, I tried to take notes throughout, and I've come up with my own David Letterman top 10 list. So I'll give a shot at kind of how this comes from, just to pull out a few things maybe for us to remember as we go along. Now, they're not in the right sequence of the real funny one ends up next or last or whatever, but I'll just try to go through. First thing we learned, Greg, we're not fragile. You are empowered. You are a citizen of this country. You are empowered to have your beliefs and have your discussion. You are not fragile, and remember that as you go along. 2, seek out dissent. I know in my position in a big company, as a head of a big company, a lot of people think you know it all. That's the first thing I learned. I knew very little about what was actually going on, what needed to happen. I had to seek out all the time because a lot of times people won't tell you what they think. The positions get weird, friend groups get weird. All of a sudden people are holding back. Seek it out, ask the questions, be curious, and be humble enough to know you don't know it all. There's smart people in this room. There's smart people in your friend group. There's smart people in your neighborhood. Seek it out. Be curious. Learn. All right, the third thing, we kind of ended with it, but it was kind of a place throughout. You know, the safe, the safe space is when you're talking to somebody. It's in yourself. There's reason for trust and faith and hope and optimism in our future. We're more aligned than we think. Don't believe all the stuff that divides us. We're more aligned than we think, especially when you have to get face-to-face with somebody. Take the time to do that. It's really easy to tweet something nasty. It's really hard to say that personally, and maybe you don't feel quite like you did. Maybe you're willing to listen a little bit more. The solution for our future and the reason for our optimism is you. It's not our government. It's we the people. It's our country. We put the government in place. There's a role, there's a responsibility that they have, but it's not up to them to tell us what to do. It's up to us as citizens. This is our country, unbelievably unique. This is an experiment. Can we make it work? I love it. Respecting others' views. Don't just listen and kind of try to figure out how to discount. Actually listen and learn and respect it. Understand it. Take it in. Challenge yourself with it. The good and evil, the ugly and the beautiful is in all of us. We don't all have this figured out. We're all on a journey here, team, right? We're all trying to figure it out and figure out how we can do things better together. Number 6 was address, don't avoid, invite the discussion. It's the start of the discussion. As soon as something crazy happens, it's the start of the discussion. It's not a time for judgment, it's time for engagement. Maybe that's something that we can do as we go forward. Voting is your voice. It's election day, team. Make sure you get involved with the process, right? That's what Nichelle said. It's your voice. Be part of it. You belong in our country, in our community, in our neighborhood. You belong here. Help us shape the future and do it together. And while we have different views, we all need to be part of the process. The whole idea of free speech that Greg and then Jeff talked about, it's the beginning of the discussion, right? Take time. This is personal. Don't just discard it somewhere. Don't just do it in a passing fancy. Take time. Engage in the relationship of what it takes to really have a discussion. Now, the part that I really like in number 9 here is the primary text, because Jeff does a great job of actually finding the text, summarizing the text, making it short enough so that I can read it and understand it. And so even I can pay attention to some of these sorts of things because I'm not the best student in the world, right? But it's there. There's resources like the Bill of Rights Institute, like the National Constitution Center, like the LIT. There's resources, there's places where you go where people who can help bring it down so that some of us who may not be inclined to get off the football field and go to the library can still be informed and still take a step forward and realize, with those primary texts, realize the amount of time that people have been thinking about these ideas, talking about these ideas, trying to figure out these principles and values and how they apply to people and societies across time. We're not the first people doing this. We can learn from those who've gone before. And the last one that I would say, have courage, understanding, and empathy. Nichelle, you talked about those. Courage, understanding, and empathy. And so remember that, especially empathy for people. This is not, it's not a society where we need to judge everybody right and wrong. How about if we just start to understand? What if we ask questions? What's going on in your life? We had a group of people at Amway years ago, and we did some different training, kind of some new unique things to help teams work together and build things together. And I was asked to come to the meeting because the folks wanted to tell me something. And they said, they told some powerful stories. Somebody said, this coworker right here, I hated him. I did not want to work with this person at all. I thought they were terrible in every single way. But through this training, I found out what they're dealing with at home. I found out about a sick child. I found out about a broken marriage. I found out about a challenge that I didn't know. Now I love this person. I'm walking in their shoes. I have a deeper understanding for who they are and what they're dealing with. No wonder they come to work with maybe a tough day ahead because of the night that they've had before. We can have empathy for people in different places, different walks of life that we have. We can find ways to reach out, have the courage to reach out and to understand. These are opportunities. These are chances that we have to come together, to think a little differently, to learn something. But let's make sure we take it with us. It's a top 10 list. It's my best shot. Hopefully it worked. So with all that, have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much.